Hi everybody, this is Anne. The basic building blocks of any design are called art elements. They include line, shape, texture, form, space, color, and value. The more you understand them, the better your pottery designs will be. In this video, I'll explain what I mean by the term space. I'll define it and show you 3 ways it is used to create your pottery designs. When I talk about the term space, I'm referring to the stark blank canvas of your constructed pottery piece. How you divide that canvas is essential to the success of the piece. I usually start by sectioning off the broadest areas of the piece first, like dividing a border around the rim. By definition, this is referred to as creating the positive and negative spaces. I then start sectioning off smaller areas, like shapes, circles, squares, rectangles, and triangles. The inside of that circle is the positive space, and the outside is called the negative space. I like to go ahead and fill a little more detail in the positive spaces, like with these concentric circles. I'm also thinking about balance. The circles create weight at the bottom of the piece as your eye draws down to it. So I'm going to connect that to the top part of the vase by drawing a stem behind it all the way to the borderline. Then I drew leaf shapes growing out of it. Notice how the leaves point outward, pointing your eye around the rest of the vase. Now I have to decide whether to fill in the positive or the negative spaces to create interest, focal points, and movement. Here's another cylinder with the same design. On this one, I decided to fill in the positive areas with the contrasting color black, then carve into that for more detail. By filling in the positive spaces, I've drawn the eye into each shape and right to the carved detail focal points of each one, yet the angles of the shape still draws your eye to the image beside it. Now remember, the space outside the shapes is the negative space. Here's another cylinder with the same design, but I filled in the negative space with the contrasting color. I had to be more strategic about how to decorate the positive space so the cylinder didn't become too busy, and I still needed to maintain separation between the two. Now here they are side by side. Same design, but you can see just how that design choices change their appearance. Let's do one more. This time, in addition to the original design, let's add another layer of marks vertically and horizontally to divide the cylinder and shapes into quadrants. Now I can fill it in like a checkerboard, where every other quadrant is filled in opposite to the one beside it. Notice how half of the same shape will have the positive area filled, and the other half will be stark with a few lines depending on the quadrant it happened to fall into. Now when you put all 3 of the cylinders together, even though they're the same design, they become a unit with each displaying its own uniqueness. That exercise showed you about using space in a 2-dimensional design. Let's see how to use space to add the illusion of a 3rd dimension. To add depth to the space, here are several ways to do it. First is with size. Objects that are closer to you will be larger and oftentimes are placed at the bottom of your space. Second, you can add depth by overlapping objects. Notice how I place the smaller butterfly just over top of the wingtip to trace it. The smaller size, the higher up on the plane, and the way it overlaps starts to create that feeling of going back in space. When I trace even smaller butterflies, the space extends even further. And don't forget, you still want to consider your flat space. By tracing the butterflies in a sort of spiral shape and angling them differently, I'm drawing your eye around the entire hexagon. A 3rd illusion to create space is by using detail. Visually, you'll be able to see more detail on objects closer to you than objects that are farther away. So if I give the front butterfly much more detail than the others, he not only becomes the leader of the pack, but the focal point where your eye lands to start moving around the piece. I still like to give the smaller objects some division marks, but with each successively smaller butterfly, distance causes you to make out less and less detail. Here's a sample that I created earlier, where I also created a border around the butterflies and painted them in. The border is clearly in the forefront, as you can see that it overlaps our leader butterfly. I made sure to position the leader at the bottom and give him the most detail. I furthered the illusion of depth by overlapping the blue butterfly over the yellow one and letting the border overlap some of them too. Finally, I thought I'd add a little sun in the very back. The bright yellow circle switched the focal point from the blue butterfly to the sun. I like that. Next, I'll show you how to create space by using color. The best design to demonstrate this is usually a landscape. So using the concepts we talked about before, I drew out a sort of paint-by-number scene with a pelican head in the forefront. His neck spans the distance from the top of the oval down to the bottom, and he overlaps all the other layers. The second smaller layer back in space would be the grass line along the riverbank. And in the very back, the other side of the river is the smallest with a tree line and mountain line with the least amount of detail. All I need to do is fill in the space, this time using basic colors without a lot of mixing so you can follow along. I'll fill in the pelican first. On objects closer in space to me, the colors will be perhaps visually brighter and bolder, more distinct and sharper. So I'm just filling in the head with the intense yellow. I added just a little red along that top borderline. Even a simple color shift like that can indicate shadows or highlights, creating subtle illusions of perspective. I used a little baby blue around the eyes. I don't like to use a lot of straight black as it flattens things out, but in this simple design I'm going to try to quickly demonstrate how darker colors can also indicate that an object is in the foreground, so I'm using black in and around the eyes. I sgraffitoed little dots from the center of each eye, as light creates reflections there, which makes him come to life. The beak is not as colorful, but does have shadows. To indicate that, I'm using a pale pink along the highlighted edge. To contrast that light color, I'm filling in the space around it, the neck, again with that black. For the feathers on his body, I drew each one separately as you would be able to make out all that detail. It became sort of a pattern that I'll fill in with the baby blue underglaze, leaving some areas of the feathers unpainted to indicate highlights where the sun would hit them. Now let's fill in the very back layer of the sky, mountain, and tree lines. In real life, if you look at the horizon, you'll see that the atmospheric conditions affects how you see the colors, especially on a foggy morning. The colors appear duller, maybe a little grayer, even fading to no color if it's really foggy or if the sun is hitting it. I watered down my baby blue to give the sky area a light wash. For the mountain line, I thought I'd use a contrasting color, a light pink. I watered that down and still gave it a quick wash, leaving some of the area without any color. For the tree line, I grayed down my green, thinned it out, then colored that in. If you want more information about how I mix my underglazes, check out the link to the video above. I have a separate little row of smaller trees in front of that layer. With a little darker green, I filled in those little trees. They're closer in space, so they're a bit darker. I colored in just a little bit darker riverbank, which gives a natural borderline for my design. I want to keep that layer of the landscape separate, so I'll fill in the river with a very, very light layer of color. I watered down some blue and laid the brush down vertically along the plate to give a hint of water. For the grass layer, I used an avocado green, filling in darker areas where they would overlap along that borderline area. For that blank area under those long grasses, I gave a little hint of yellow-green, but not as dark as the pelican feathers, or they'll compete for your eye attention. I wanted that yellow head to be the focal point of the whole painting, so I avoided filling in the space around his head. Instead, I added a small blue border around the top half of the oval to actually frame the very top of his head and highlight it. To make him stand out even more, I'm adding border lines using my fingernail detailer brush. The dark border lines call attention to anything they're used with. They really make him come to life. They also help him to pop out in front of the whole scene just as I had hoped. Now here's one I did earlier, the same design, but I added more detail and a little more imagery. You can see how the colors in the foreground are much brighter and sharper compared to the colors in the distance that might be affected by the atmosphere. So they're more muted and faded, pushing him to the background. I hope these tips help you utilize your space better in terms of positive negative, depth, and perspective. Thanks to the newest members of our Little Street Pottery Research Facility team. If you'd like to join the team and earn a title, click on the Super Thanks button or the link to buy me a coffee. It also really helps us out if you hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. See you next time in the studio.